Hello and welcome to Text Readings with Greg Stafford, where we progressively work our way through the ancient biblical and related texts to try to gain a good sense of ancient history and understanding, particularly as it relates to the god Jah, whom we call in English Jaho, and who is known as the God of Moses, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob, all these famous biblical figures, David. And so we focus on the biblical text because we really believe that God exists. We believe he's the one responsible for the creation of all things and for giving all things an opportunity, in particular humans, to exist in his image on his earth, but to have the ability to make choices, to decide, and then be judged. So we believe that we're in a period of judgment by that God, Jah, similar to the way that he has judged peoples in the past based on the situation at the time, the condition they were in, and according to the existing laws. But none of the things that have happened since what the Bible describes as the time of the Garden of Eden have been completely representative of Jah's will for the earth or for humans, which he explicitly stated in the opening chapters of Genesis. So even though we're not in the condition that Jah desired for us all right now, we believe that nonetheless he is accomplishing his will through various humans and spirit sons of his as we go through this time where other spirit sons of his are interacting with humans in ways where they get to exist and do different things and even have authority now and in times past. And so that's why in the Bible you read texts that speak of the nations being given to the sons of God. Why you read about different princes, spirit princes, as rulers or gods of different nations, with the spirit authority assigned to Israel being Michael, the archangel, who appears to be similar to or identical with the angel of Jaho, who is singled out more so than any other angels in the Hebrew text, like we will read about today, in the way that Jaho uses different angelic sons of his. Some are used differently than others at different times for different reasons. But all of this is ultimately leading toward the recovery of Jaho's original will for the earth, or even in a greater sense, right, more fulfilled, but to a greater extent, and glory to him after having gone through this period of judgment. So we're in Exodus right now. Right? We've come from the point of where Jaho created everything. We had the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, all the created things. Then their choice to do according to or against what Jaho told them not to do, the one thing that he laid upon them, not something necessarily that they would never get to do. That is, eat from the tree of knowledge of good and bad and the tree of life. Trees that were there, but the Jaho spared them from because they were not ready to make those kinds of decisions in order to achieve eternal life. They had just been made and were new and were in the period during which he was teaching them what to do. So that once they reached a point where they knew how to decide things according to the ways in which he had instructed them, then eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad wouldn't be the kind of problem that it was here, because they were not allowed to do it. They were not ready for it. He had not taught them much of anything that we know of beyond the animals and the different things that had been made, but they had not moved beyond the Garden of Eden space. And so there was certainly not this significant growth and development at the point where they chose to go against their development. And so we then move past that through all the different events leading to the flood. And then after the time when the ark landed, the migration from eastern Anatolia, modern day Turkey, down into Mesopotamia, Sumer, all the kingdoms and cities built by Nimrod and others. And then Jehovah's dispersion of language at the Tower of Babel, then sending humans with different speech throughout the known world. And so we ultimately get to a point where Jehovah chose Abraham out of Ur in ancient Mesopotamia, and through him made a promise that there would be a seed that would come by which all nations of the earth would bless themselves. And Abraham's seed through Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and the sons of Jacob came to be in Egypt for many years. After which they died, and eventually things changed. A new Pharaoh came, and the Hebrews were not seen the same way in the Egyptians' eyes. And it wasn't always perfect even during the time of Joseph and Jacob's presence, and a Pharaoh who respected them. So when times eventually changed and the Egyptians began to hate the Hebrews who lived among them versus cultivating a working relationship and growing and building together, kind of like you see, for a while anyway, with Joseph, Jacob, and the Egyptians of their day. And so when times changed and it was difficult for the Hebrews to live, and then deadly, right? Because Pharaoh then began to fear the Hebrews, that they would conspire with the other nations and fight against him. And so instead of trying to work against that, right, even if that was his concern and make them more his allies, he just basically made what he was afraid of more likely and eventually certain, right? Because if that's how you're going to continue to act towards other people, they begin to sense or feel that way from you, and it rubs off. And so this antagonism, this bitterness starts to develop based on the perception of one party or the other or both. So that's what happened, to the point where Pharaoh tried to kill the firstborn sons of Egypt, and then all of them. But it wasn't as easy for him to do, especially with Jehovah working with the Hebrews, right? He's bringing forth this seed through Abraham, all about the body of the Messiah that he's going to use as the last Adam to redeem us from what the first Adam lost, in a legal sense that would allow him to repurchase us from our own decisions, right? Because we have a condition that we've inherited. And so we're different from the original sinners, Adam and Eve, in that way, because to some extent we can't help it. We have an inherited imperfection that through faith in Christ in our new life, we will be able to get rid of. And we can fight against, just like Joseph, in large part. But it's not the way we were originally made. It's the way we have become and developed since that time. All right, so now we're in Egypt. The Hebrews are having children. Jehovah is using them as the line through which he's going to bring forth the promised seed to restore humanity. And so a Hebrew woman in Egypt during this time preserves her son Moses alive. He becomes known as Moses, but I'm referring to him in the historical sense after having already read the account, because he's brought up out of the water by the daughter of Pharaoh. And then she has the mother of Moses suckle the child until he's mature enough to be brought into Pharaoh's house. Then that's what happens. In this position, Moses, as a mature Egyptian in the royal house, observes mistreatment by the Egyptians to the Hebrews, his actual, closer association and relatives. And so he strikes out at one of the Egyptians who was striking out and beating one of the Hebrew workers, oppressing them severely, and kills the Egyptian, buries him. And eventually it gets found out, right? He starts to kind of get more involved with the Hebrews, and they then reject him, and they know what he did, and so they're kind of afraid. And then he gets afraid, and then Pharaoh tries to kill him, but then he takes off. Right? He goes over to Midian. He meets these women at the well, one of whom is the priest of Midian's daughter, Zipporah, or he ends up marrying Zipporah after meeting the priest of Midian's daughters at the well. And so he becomes a son-in-law of Jethro and a sheepherder just like him. That's where we pick up with our text reading today. Let's take a look. Exodus 3, 1 through 15. I'll be reading the Hebrew, followed by the Greek. That's what's indicated by H and G, respectively. Now, I'll point out, as I did in one or more of my prior shows on Exodus, I'm still in the process of formally completing my translation work. And in the course of that, I make different decisions, thinking of different ways I can best present the text. And at one point, I began translating the Greek text, and in doing so, transliterating all of the proper names. That's how I started out, but then I changed it. But I have not gone back and changed every single transliteration that I've made. So I might mention or read actual transliterations that sound a little different than the proper names you're used to. But most of the time, I'll just consciously make a switch as well. I may say one or two just so you hear how they're sounded, or just because I'm reading it so closely. But now you know why if it sounds different. Okay, so Moses has now become the son-in-law of Jethro, shepherder in Midian, left Egypt. Exodus 3, verse 1, Hebrew translation. Now Moses had come to be a shepherd of the sheep of Jethro, his father-in-law, priest of Midian. So he was leading the flock beyond the desert, and he came to the mountain of God, Horeb. Verse 1, Greek translation, Moyses was shepherding the sheep of Iothor, his father-in-law, the priest of Madiam. He led the sheep by the desert, and he came to the mountain, Choreb. Verse 2, Hebrew translation, then a messenger of Jaho began to appear to Moses in a flame of fire. He makes his spirits a flame of fire. We'll get back to that in our Trinity in the Bible in conflict. Appeared to Moses in a flame of fire out of the middle of the bush. He could see, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not burnt up. Verse 2, Greek translation, then he was made to see a messenger of Lord Jaho in a flame of fire out of the bush. And he could see the bush being burned by the fire, but the bush was not burnt up. Verse 3, Hebrew translation, so Moses began to say, I will turn aside so I can see this great sight, why the bush is not being burned. Verse 3, Greek translation, Moyses said, after I arrive, I will see this great vision, why it is that the bush is not burned. Verse 4, Hebrew translation, when Jaho noticed that Moses had turned aside to see, then God called out to him from the middle of the bush, and he said, Moses, Moses. So Moses said, I am here. Verse 4, Hebrew translation, then as Lord Jaho saw that Moyses approached to see, the Lord called to him out of the bush, saying, Moyses, Moyses. And Moyses said, what is it? Verse 5, Hebrew translation, then the messenger said. God called out, the messenger said, you must not approach here. Take your sandals from your feet, because the place which you are standing upon is soil that is to be treated as sacred. That's pretty much exactly what the prince of the army of Jaho tells Joshua in Joshua chapter 5. Verse 5, Greek translation, the messenger said, you should not come near. You must remove the sandal from your feet, for the place in which you have stood is holy earth. Verse 6, Hebrew translation, next the messenger began to say, and it's not always that the term malach or angelos appears where you see messenger, but it's the continuation by pronominal reference back to the use of that term. And so There's no change. It's the one speaking to him out of the bush, the angel of Lord Jaho. Next, the messenger began to say, I am God of your father, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. Then Moses started to hide his face because he had become afraid to look at God. Verse 6, Greek translation, the messenger also said to Moyses, I am the God of your father, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. But Moyses turned away from God's face, for he was in fear when it came to looking at God. And of course, he's looking at the angel in the seemingly burning bush, who is representing Jaho and speaking for and as Jaho. In fact, this account is not only clear in that regard, right? The angel is the one representing and speaking as Jaho, but in the book of Acts, chapter 7, several times it refers to an angel as the one doing this with Moses. And then later on, I think in verse 53 or in the 50s, it refers to angels in the plural as those who directed or dictated, basically, the law to Moses. Though the text says, we'll get to later, that it was God who did it. So we know how these things work, or we should. Right? It's all over the place. It's described in these accounts the ways that the angel of Jaho and the angels of God are used to represent, speak for, and dictate laws to his people for him. And then they're even identified explicitly in New Testament texts that refer to these accounts. Verse 7, Hebrew translation, Jaho began to say, I have looked at the distress of my people, which is because of the Egyptians. I have heard their outcry as a result of those who oppress them, for I have learned about their suffering. Verse 7, Greek translation, but Lord Jaho said to Moyses, after looking, I saw the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and their outcry I have heard because of their work masters, for I have learned of their suffering. Just like he learned, he went down to see exactly what was going on in places like Sodom and Gomorrah, Tower of Babel. He knows, but he also allows a large degree of activity and decision-making so that judgments can be done. However, when certain things occur, either in special individual or more limited personal circumstances, or when a larger aggregate of people cry out to Jaho, then that's when he'll go in and look closer, because his spirit's in those people. And the degree to which they are suffering beyond what he wants to happen in certain ways individually or aggregately over a long period of time, regardless of the judgment we're in, then that's when he responds. He sets in different peoples what he wants to know about in order to respond in more specific and close examination ways than what is allowed overall, and which is overseen through angels and others. And so it's not looked at. But when it comes to doing things like changing languages or determining if there's anyone or if there's several or 10 or 50 people righteous in a city, or when it comes to breaking the authority of the greatest power on earth to release the people through whom the one to be born is coming, the promised one. So these are more involved activities. You see what I'm saying? He doesn't just override everything in ways and immediately there's a change, like right there. They're done procedurally, fairly quickly, by comparison of the suffering. And so, for example, again, if you look at the way he dealt with Sodom and Gomorrah, if you look at the way he dealt with those at the Tower of Babel, if you look at the way he's going to deal with the Egyptians, it doesn't take a long time, especially once he decides it's time. So pay attention to how things go here and to what he says about how he's going to deal with those who abuse his people. Verse 8, Hebrew translation, I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of this land and into a land that is good and wide, a land flowing with milk and honey, and a place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Verse 8, Greek translation, I came down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to lead them out of that land and to guide them into a land that is good and sizable, into a land flowing with milk and honey, into the place of the Canaanites and the Kettites and the Amorites and Perizzites and Girgasites and Uites and Jebusites. These are Greek transliterations, so a little less familiar, of course, in the Hebrew text. Verse 9, Hebrew text. Now behold, the outcry of the sons of Israel has come in to me, and also I have seen the suffering by which the Egyptians are oppressing them. So we've reached the point, right? And he knew it was time, right? He had Moses over here. He knew more needed to happen in ways that would develop so that once the right time came, remember, all of this everything is for the purpose of the body of his son, the seed that was promised in Genesis, who would come through this line of people. That's why we're talking about Hebrews in Egypt at all, right? Of all the peoples, right, of ancient times. Why are we talking about these people? Because they are the descendants of Abraham, of Mesopotamia. And Jaho has brought them into this land under originally very good conditions and then prepared them for very bad conditions, and then the people of the land made it even worse. And so this then, of course, does develop in this group of people through which he's developing a body capable of saving all the people. They're learning what? Right? We're all doing things against Jaho in a way that he is organized according to the dispersion of the sons of God, but who are allowed to do different things and then be judged. So when he allows these people to go into a land like Egypt under good conditions, and then the people of that land make it bad, why would allowing that be something that you would allow for a time? Well, as I've discussed in the past, you not only have the people who are experiencing the oppression to be concerned about, you have people on the other side, we'll call them the oppressors, but not all of whom are on the same level in terms of advocating for the degree of oppression that may be existing. And so you have a lot of judgment taking place there. But when it comes to our salvation, the Hebrews' enslavement in Egypt developed a condition of subservience so that the line of peoples through which Jah was developing, that would come eventually through David, would be more prepared, even though it is a kingly line. Right? He needs a Messiah to be born in the royal line, but not to be a king, right? Not a king right now. Not during a time when the sons of God and the devil are being judged as well. Right? He gets the kingship later, or has it in the all-authoritative sense now, during which the judgment is finalizing, and after which the kingdom will be established and visible and manifest in heaven and on earth, according to the text. So this mistreatment of the Hebrews ingrains in their genetic stock this subservient attitude that Jaho can unlock and attach through the bringing together of different Hebrews over the course of time, so that his son is both born in a royal line with the mindset of a slave, right? Someone who's there to serve him all the way, because this isn't the time or place to do anything else. And that's exactly what he did. And he's even described as having a slave's form in Philippians 2, which we'll get to further in another show. So, cats are coming around. So I hope that makes sense to you in terms of why would this even be allowed at all, right? Well, first of all, we're in a period of time that everybody is dying, in which everybody is dying, right? But the Jaho keeps certain people alive in certain ways and under varying conditions in order to achieve an end result. Part of that is his son giving his life as a king, but who is as a servant sacrificing himself to God. And so he had that in Isaac, right? Abraham and Isaac, but still you have a lot happening from from their period forward through this line. You have different people showing different traits and qualities. Jaho will manage all of them and use the ones that will get to the right genetic design for his son. But these conditions during this time are what were necessary in part. If you look just at the way the son lived, right? Is that not the mindset and the way you would see a servant, a real servant, exist? So all of this was really conditioning, genetic conditioning, you could say, for the purpose of him not being this glorified king on earth, but to give his life so he could be a glorified king in heaven and over the new earth. All right, so it's important to keep those in mind because we could get lost and caught up in just the story about the mistreatment of the Hebrews and the oppression of the Egyptians. Jaho handles it all. Everyone who has died has been judged. No one gets away with anything. And everything is for a purpose to ultimately achieve a goal, that is the restoration of all things. So any mistreatment that was done at different times would be for the purpose of something greater anyway. Back to the reading, let's finish it up. We read, let's start verse 10, Hebrew translation, "Go, I am sending you to Pharaoh. Bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt." Verse 10, Greek translation, "Come here now, that I may send you to Pharaoh." Sorry, my cats. "That I may send you to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and you will bring forth my people, the sons of Israel, out of the land of Egypt." Verse 11, Hebrew translation, "Then Moses said to God, who am I, that I will go to Pharaoh, and that I will bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" Verse 11, Greek translation, "Then Moses said to God, who am I, that I will go to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and that I will lead the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt?" Right? I'm a shepherd. I know I can see their but he's from Egypt. And so he's not unfamiliar with supernatural powers from them too. And as we get to later, that comes up again. So there's a good reason to fear the Egyptians. And in spite of the fact that Moses is speaking to God through this angel. But he goes on. He says, in verse 12, it says, "So God began to say," so Moses wants to know, who am I? So, okay, who am I that I'm going to do this? How am I going to be able to go to Pharaoh and all of Egypt and actually accomplish what you're talking about? So God began to say, verse 12, "I will be with you. This is the sign for you, showing that I have sent you." I'm going to highlight this part right here. This is a sign. At your going out of Egypt with the people, you will serve God upon this mountain. Verse 12, Greek translation, "So God spoke to Moses, saying, I will be with you, and this is the sign for you, showing that I sent you forth." I'll highlight that as well. "After you lead my people out of Egypt, then you will serve God in this mountain." Verse 13, Hebrew translation, "Then Moses said to God, consider this, I come in to the sons of Israel, and I've said to them, God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What will I say to them?" Verse 13, Greek translation, "Then Moses said to God, consider this." Because this is something more like that a human who doubts things would think of, right? It's not something God is anticipating. He's sending you forward and expecting you to go, while realizing that you may still have limitations. It's humans that express those. "So Moses said to God, consider this, I will go to the sons of Israel, and I'll say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. They'll ask me, what is his name? Right? So he doesn't know his name at this point. What will I say to them? Verse 14, Hebrew translation. So God began to say to Moses, I will become who I will become. Then God said, therefore you will say to the sons of Israel, I will become has sent me to you. We'll go ahead and highlight that. Verse 14, Greek translation. So God said to Moses, I am the one who really exists. And God said, therefore you will say to the sons of Israel, the one who really exists, I like that right there, has sent me to you. Verse 15, our last text of today's reading, then we'll go back and talk a little bit about it. God continued to say to Moses, further, you will say to the sons of Israel, Jaho, God of your fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my eternal name. And this is my reminder for each existing generation and for each generation thereafter. Verse 15, Greek translation. God spoke again to Moses. Further, you will say to the sons of Israel, Lord Jaho, the God of your fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my eternal name, and my memory from generation to generation. So, I did stop and talk, about several things. For example, we summarized the reading, of course, to the point where Moses is a shepherd in Midian, has married a daughter of the priest of Midian. And then as he's out in Mount Horeb, the angel of Jaho, or an angel of Jaho, appears to him in a flame of fire, speaks as Jaho, tells him it's holy ground, take off your sandals, just like the prince of the army of Jaho told Joshua. He identifies himself, the angel speaking for Jaho, as the God of his fathers, right here, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Moses becomes afraid because of the display of power and representation. But then Jaho tells him that he has seen the oppression of Israel, right? Well, so what was the last thing Moses saw in Egypt? I mean, the Hebrews were kind of, not happy with him either. But really, the last thing he saw, other than Pharaoh trying to kill him and the Hebrews not liking him, was the Hebrews being mistreated, was it not? Wasn't that what caused everything? So here's Jaho telling someone in the line of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob who felt the same way that he did upon closely inspecting the treatment, right? So Moses at one point, he knew there was not a fair situation, right? Obviously, especially as the work labor increased. But then when Moses actually looked at, the people and the taskmaster and saw it directly, he reacted. Same with Jaho. Once he took a good long look and understood and knew things were where they needed to be in order to proceed and create the seed, promised seed's body, he took action. He appeared to Moses, told him what he was going to do, and he was going to bring the Hebrews out of Egypt. But then Moses says, well, what am I going to say? I'm just this shepherd, right? I'm, Pharaoh in Egypt's a big place. They have gods. What am I going to tell them? He says, first in verse 11, right? He says, who am I? That I will lead them out of Egypt. And God tells him, I will be with you. Right? I highlighted that right here because this is in Hebrew, ehyeh. The same term used twice in verse 14, right here. Ehyeh, Asher, and then ehyeh again So before we even get to verse 14, we're told in verse 12, God responds to Moses saying, what am I going to do? How am I going to accomplish this? Right? You could probably accomplish this, but what am I going to do against Pharaoh? And bring all these people out. Jaho, he says, Ehyeh, I will be with you. Or even if we say I am, right? Sometimes it can be I am, but it's usually I will be. That's how you translate the Hebrew imperfect. And he says, this is a sign to show I have sent you. Ehyeh is a sign, or the sign that will show them he's with them. Verse 12, he says the same thing. I will be with you. Now in verse 12, it uses asamai in the Greek text, the future form of ami. Right? So ami is I am. Haon is the existing one. It's a participle form of I am. Same verb, related to the same verb. And so in verse 14 in the Greek text, it says, I am egoimi, the one who really exists, the existing one, the truly existing one, haon. The one who's really here now. This isn't, I am the truly existing one. So it doesn't use asamai here. In the same way, while the Hebrew text is consistent, it says I ehyeh, and then in verse 14, ehyeh, asher ehyeh. Verse 12 of the Greek text says asamai, and in the Greek text of the common Septuagint, right? Not the different Jewish versions of the Septuagint, which do have different renderings of verse 14. But in the common Greek Septuagint rendering, the more commonly accepted Septuagint rendering of verse 14 is egoimi haon, not egoimi asamai. Right? So they're in verse 14, they're definitely creating this sort of I am with you now, which will continue into the time that you're with these people to bring them out. But in verse 12, it explicitly uses the future. So it's very clear that in verse 14, even though it uses the present participle, haon, it's very much inclusive of, while maintaining the present emphasis on God's existence with Moses right now, that it will continue. In verse 12, it's explicitly shown to be future. And so even in verse 14, with the present meaning of existing now and going forward, it clearly has a future application consistent with what is explicit in verse 12 as the sign to show them, right? So there's the present. He's with Moses right now, and that's how they're going to know that he's really with him, right? I am the one who really exists. I'm going to be with you. Verse 12, I will be with you. I will be with you. Even in the Greek version, the future form, asamai. So this is all moving toward that contextually. And it does not identify ehyeh, asher ehyeh, or ehyeh right here, or egoimi haon, or haon right here. None of those are identified as the name. So Moses wants to know, how am I going to show that you're with me, right? Who am I, and how am I going to do this? God tells him how he's going to do that. And God tells him who he is. He's someone who's with Jaho. I am with you. I will be with you. I will be ehyeh, or egoimi haon, which is shown to be related to the future sign to show that God is with them, is the sign. That's the sign. That's not the name. That's the sign that Jaho is with Moses. He is really existing with him, and he will show that. He will be with him at that time. And is he not? Right? When he throws down his staff and it becomes a snake, and then Pharaoh's priests do the same thing, and then Moses' snake eats those two. Is that not Jaho being with him in the future sense? Verse 12 is showing, along with other things, of course, too. Right? All the things we'll get to, the plagues, different stuff. So, Jaho never called himself the I am. He never said, ego eimi, ha ego eimi. Ego eimi is never, ever, ever. And by that I mean not even one single time ever in the biblical text used as a name. It is used to introduce a description or a name, or to tell something that you're going to do something. I am doing this. Jesus, as we've discussed in other shows and in my CW Jaw Talk show on I am, which I highly encourage you to review because we discuss this text in Exodus 3, several of these texts in our reading today, along with texts like John 8:58 that are alleged to present Jesus as either calling himself this never before named being I am in the biblical text, or claiming to be eternal, neither one of which makes sense or is grammatically possible. And so it's another example of Trinitarian distortion of biblical texts to fit their own preconceived views, which have nothing to do with these texts, right? Those are creeds. Those are later council formulations. The Trinity, this I am idea about God and Jesus, and again as persons of one ousia. That's not biblical teaching, right? That's later heresy that people who reject the biblical teaching developed and then shoved in front of everyone under the threat of being a heretic or in league with Caiaphas, just like the scribes and Pharisees abused people during the time of Jesus and made them so afraid they couldn't even confess Jesus. So we know when we deal with certain Trinitarian apologetic nuts today and people who, they freak out, right? They really do. When it comes to like John 8:58, Exodus 3:14, they see anything but I am there, they lose it, right? Most of them just think immediately, mistranslation, you don't believe in the Trinity, you're denying the Bible. No, all of that is wrong. And they're taught all of that false doctrine by the so-called scholars, right? They're so knowledgeable, they can't seem to grammatically translate John 8:58 in a sensible way, right? They have to come into that text with Trinitarianism in place, and it's either he's eternal or he's calling himself I am. And so they don't care. They'll confuse people. They'll look grammatically ridiculous. Because if they have to do that to promote their view, they're going to do it, right? They'll say things that are just make no sense, and you can show them that this is grammatically correct, right? I've done this, again, in the CW Jaw Talk show, and I am, so I'm not going to get into it in too much detail. But it happens so much, right? Here we're reading a text, we're getting the information, it makes sense. We get the teaching about Jaho, that is his name, right? Right here. God continued to say, Jaho, this is my name. That's the answer to Moses' question. What is his name? This he explicitly states to be that name. What happens, and the reason a lot of people get into the whole Yahweh pronunciation thing, is because, again, so-called scholars think that the divine name, Yod-He, Wah-He, has to be related to the verb haya or hawa, from which we get ehya, I will be. But that's not necessary. And as I've shown and argued previously, it's inconsistent with the phonetic evidence we have, ya-o, ya, none of which shows any derivation of that pronunciation from forms of the verb emi. You see? So the actual evidence we have for the pronunciation and use of the name does not show that it is derived or related to the same verb as the one used by Jaho's angel, so that Moses would be able to tell the people and they would know who he is and why they're going to be freed. Jaho, that is his name, is with me. I will be with you. Ehye, Esamai. This is the sign, not the name. Trinitarians have flipped it, right? They've mistranslated it, read back into the text a metaphysic that's inconsistent with it, and they've misinterpreted it when it comes to the significance of the use of Ehye, Esamai, or Egoemi Haon, and how those are indications that God will be with Moses so the people would know he is Jaho, and that is his name. So it's difficult, I know, when we deal with Trinitarians and others, because they have gotten beaten over the head in many cases, figuratively, of course. Pretty much. Yeah, I mean, it's figurative, right? But it's not figurative beating, man. They get told that translations other than I am that I am, or I am who I am, or before Abraham was, I am, right? They have taken the most likely and obvious meaning of these texts and translation and just destroyed them for a doctrinal pretext. Right? So they can keep arguing with people about metaphysics, right? They've gutted the story of Exodus 3 so they can make people think there's a metaphysic involving I am, or a name, that's more important than all of this. And yet none of it is true. You know what's more important than all of that? These texts. I will be with you. That's the sign. Not the name. And it doesn't even mean he's eternal necessarily, right? I mean the subject job. But in Revelation, we know I am the one who was, right? Ha'ain. The one who is, Ha'on. And the one who is coming. So if Ha'on alone indicated eternality, which is not used in John 8:58, by the way, right? Then there would be no need to further qualify it in the past sense that John does in Revelation by means of Ha'ain. So in almost every way, what it means to be, the being, or the Ha'on, or the Ehye, they get it wrong. When it comes to which one is the name, they get it wrong. When it comes to the significance of Ehye or Ha'on, they get it wrong in the historical sense. And in the other texts which use Ha'on, like in Revelation. Not ones like in Hebrews 1 where it's used to describe someone, right? When it calls you and it says, who is the apalgasma and character of God's hypostases, it's describing him as those things, using the descriptive formula, introductory formula, showing the present state in which he is those things, Ha'on. It's not calling him the Ha'on in Hebrews 1. I mean, the Trinitarians, it's hard to believe, they're really thinking clearly sometimes when they argue with you over these very easy to establish translations and meanings. So even though I've spent a few extra minutes here kind of, going over it and explaining why it's such a problem, I think these texts are actually very clear and straightforward if you know how to explain them and you can show the different uses of verbs, like in verse 12, Ehye and Esamai, as it relates to what God says in verse 14, Ehye and Ha'on, as that would be the sign that God is with Moses, and then the name that Jah explicitly gives to identify him now and in the future. And it's not Ha'on or Egoemi or Ehyeh. Right? Those are descriptions of him in ways that will be fulfilled. But his actual name is right there. And you know what? Trinitarians don't usually put it right there. In fact, even the quote-unquote Christian copies of the Septuagint we have, earliest ones in this text, use Lord. Does that not change the meaning of this text? Look at it. Verse 15, Jaho, this is my eternal name. Lord, this is my eternal name. Lord is basically the meaning of Baal. And while it may be applicable to Jah and Jesus in the titular sense in which they are owner, master, or the one who have authority, I think probably the last thing the ancient Hebrews would use in this text in place of the divine name they were given as the eternal memorial and reminder to them, I think they'd be horrified, the Hebrews in ancient times, right? Not today necessarily, or in certain times since the days of Christianity. A lot has changed. But look at those two. Jaho. That's money right there. I'm putting that in green. That is money. This is not Jaho. That's his eternal name? Well, if you're a Trinitarian, I mean, they do say that today, right? They call him Lord, Lord God, Lord. No, it's Jah. It's Jaho. And if you want to know why it's still Jah, even though it says Jaho in the text, the Tetragrammaton here, is this not given to Moses here? Well, Moses is the one who sings in Exodus 15 to Jah. The first time that name is used by the one to whom Jaho was given. So I think we're in pretty good company using both Jah and Jaho. But I don't know that would apply equally to those who use Lord or even God in place of the actual name given. So I want to focus on the positive aspects of the text, of course, as we have, but because so much is made of verse 14 and other texts and then the divine name, I mean, when you really just look at it, when you look at even just, I guess from verses 12 to 15, how much Trinitarians get wrong and how much they have misled people for a long time when it comes to the significance of what Jah told Moses would be the sign, and then how they misapply and confuse people when it comes to the Messiah and the verbs used in these texts. And then the divine name. They not only failed to pronounce it correct, right? They instead try to push this association with the verb in verses 14 and 12, hawa, against all of the best available phonetic and other evidence that shows that's not necessarily true at all. And it would be it would show in certainly in terms of the divine name's suffix, right? In Yahweh, if you're going to try to associate Yahweh as the divine name with Haya or Hawa, well then why does no other name end in the pronunciation E? When it contains a theophoric element in the suffix part, ah. It's always ah. It's never E. Yet they would have us say E for the final part of the divine name when they can't even show it's related to the verb haya. So they're so lost on that. I mean, they're never going to come back unless they just actually accept the best available evidence, the way we can show it was actually spoken, right? For Jah or Yah, for at least 600 years, about from 300 or so BCE to 300 or so CE, as I showed in my wide job CW Jaw Talk show. Well, we can show the Jews were pronouncing it as Yah or Jah, as we do in anglicized terms today, over and against others who were pronouncing it differently, especially in the later early century CE. And then we have Yah'o. We never have a transliteration or a phonetic representation of Yahweh prior to the Samaritan use that's described in the first several centuries CE. So there really is no credible basis for using Yahweh. Not in association with the verb in 14, Hawa, Haya, or based on the phonetic representations of the divine name and other names which incorporate theophoric elements of the divine name and are always in the suffix part pronounced ah. Yet you still have people today running around, right? I guess because they hate Jehovah or the Watchtower, people use that formula name so much because the evidence isn't on their side. So what is it? What's causing them not to go nuts, right? Why can't you see it? They can't. I had a conversation with someone recently. I point out exactly, in some respects, what I'm telling you now. It's made no difference. So why waste your time, right? If they're not going to look at the evidence, why keep presenting it? And then you have the substitution, right? I mean, the wholesale in many respects, most often in biblical texts today, by Trinitarians especially, and others, but Lord and God, right? That's not his name. That is never, other than in texts which misrepresent the text, his name. So these are major issues, are they not? I mean, keep them in mind, right? We don't want to necessarily, this isn't about looking for a fight or going and running and going to the Trinitarians and say, hey, you know what, you guys got all these things wrong in these texts. You know that they know that. Or if they don't think that, they don't want to hear it or talk to you about it on the level that you need to be productive. And if any do want to, then go for it. Otherwise, this is for us. This is so you understand these texts and can make sense of them, and then you'll be able to help people who are next, right? We can't help it if others are going to be creed-bound. We can't help it if they're going to put the traditions of humans above the traditions of the text. We know there are going to be people who do that. They did it in Jesus' day. So the idea that we wouldn't have that today is not very reasonable, would you say? So it shouldn't surprise us is what I'm getting at. Just because this is clear to us, right? It sounds so clear. It's like, oh, okay, let me show them this. Well, maybe, but usually they're committed for reasons beyond the reasons that are given. Right? There's a lot more riding on their acceptance or rejection of the divine name or God as a Trinity or I am than just taking a closer look at the evidence, right? They've built up a long tradition of this stuff, right? I mean, it's in all their biblical translations. And by in, I mean like I am, not I will be, or I have been, I've existed, I was, something like that in John 58, or with the express predicate, I am the Christ. You know, they mess up all those texts, right? So their translation in Exodus and elsewhere already has a long tradition of misrepresenting these texts and not using the divine name or using Yahweh, right? These are really embedded in their texts and in their books and in their beliefs. So the likelihood we're just going to be able to overcome all of that and get everybody to see what we can see is not high. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try where we can really, we think be effective. But you see what I'm saying? Don't think you're all of a sudden just going to change everybody, because it's not about the evidence in most cases. It can be, and it should be, but oftentimes, just like with the Pharisees and others, it's about their tradition. It's about how much they've invested in these texts to this point. And when you look at Trinitarians and those who have not represented texts like Exodus 3:14 and other related texts correctly, going forward, just try to think of the best ways that you can overcome that, right? Because most of the time you'll be dealing with people who have Bibles that either don't use the divine name, making verse 15 a lot less meaningful, or using Lord and God, in which case just misrepresenting his real name, right? Or they're going to have Bible translations that use I am as a name in this text, verse 14, and even in texts like John 8:58. That's a lot to overcome for some people, right? Because it's their Bible, right? And you're telling them it's wrong. So be more understanding if it's not something they just get right away, right? You may have to think a little bit more about the best way to help them see, because you don't want them to lose faith in the Bible, right? They believe in the Bible, their Bible just misrepresents the divine name, pronunciation, or the use, and some of these texts like the I am texts. So what are you going to do? Well, you could show them this video or the other video I did on I am sayings, or maybe something that's been written. But when you're talking to people, I mean, if you're really trying to be effective, and you know they have a Bible and it says these things, and you don't want to get into all the different, grammatical discussions. I mean, they can happen, but how are you going to most quickly get them to see that there's more going on than what's in their translation of the text? Maybe it's a good idea, if you're going to deal with text issues with people like Exodus 3:14, try to compile a list, 5 to 10 translations, and have half of them show what they show, and have the other half show what is shown by others. That's important because it will help them see that their translation is in company, right? You don't want people being defensive to the extent you can help it. So if you're going to engage them and still try to show them that they're using incorrect information, right? It's their Bible, though. So you have to be a little more sensitive. But maybe if you show them other Bibles, comparison with theirs and others, the goal is, and remember I talked about this in terms of our living as a Christian and what it involves, and planting seeds, and how that's not always something that happens so quickly, or even the first time you plant the seed. If you show them those translations, right? If nothing else, if you're not able to get into a grammatical discussion or a contextual discussion like we did today in our text reading about Exodus, and Exodus 3:14 in particular, and what God tells Moses about how he will be able to tell the people that he is with them and what is his name. If you're able to show them other Bibles, I think, and make sure it's not just, I used to do it, a list where they were just other translations that read the way I felt was correct and not the way theirs was. Then I realized, let me just show examples from both so that they don't feel defensive about their own Bible. That means a lot to people. And most of what their Bible, even if it doesn't have the divine name or uses these I am translations, most of it's still correct and good for them. So we don't want to alienate them from the text. That's what's happened because of the translation they're using. But they're thinking the same thing about us, right? So the way I think to best neutralize, or to begin a discussion and neutralize that antagonism there, or those different views, is to show both representations of both person's position in different texts and say, okay, well, as you can see, just wanted to show you, I do realize that other translations agree with you and do say I am there, but there's others that don't. And so I just wanted to share that with you so you understand there's more going on here. And if you want to talk about it more, let me know. All right? Then it's on them. All right? Now you've planted a seed where they know there's more translations of Exodus 3:14 than I am who I am. There's more translations of Exodus 3:15 than Lord, the God of your fathers, right? There's either Yahweh or Jehovah, right? But now, so let's say they have a Bible, I think like New Jerusalem Bible or Jerusalem Bible, that says Yahweh is my name. Well, now you can at least point out that the reason why that is the case is because a lot of people see an association between the divine name and the verb used in verses 12 and 14, Haya, Hawa. One's a more archaic form of the other. But that's not proven to be the case. It's just an assumption that some people have made based on similarities in the forms of the terms. and that the actual phonetic or pronunciation evidence we have, particularly in ancient Greek forms, biblical and non-biblical people, like Diodorus, right, that represent the way it was pronounced. Okay, so that tells you what they were really saying. And it is never Yahweh or anything like it in the second part, right? Obviously, the first part, Yah is the same. So there are easy ways, I believe, you can deal with these more complicated issues like the divine name, use, or pronunciation, and the translation and meaning of Haya and Ego Eimi Haon. And don't forget the use of asamai, the future form, in verse 12. Sometimes we point out in verse 14 that other ancient Greek translations use asamai, has asamai, more similar to how we understand Ehya, Asher, Ehya. But even in the more traditional Septuagint text, it uses Ego Eimi Haon. In verse 12, in speaking of the exact same sign that is further described in verse 14, it's the future asamai that is used. And so while the present here still fits with that because it's emphasizing the present existence and its ongoing quality with Moses as he goes into Egypt, it really is a future sense shown by verse 12 and the association with verse 14 and the overall context. So I hope this has been helpful to you in all of those respects, as well as bringing us further forward into our reading of Exodus chapter 3. We'll pick up right here in our next text reading, which will probably be sometime early next week, Monday or Tuesday, because I'm going to take off tomorrow and Saturday, but then I plan on being back Sunday so that we can redo live CW Jaw Talk 13 on ancient aliens and the flood.